Hi, my name is Sparrow, and I am the artist and instructor behind LearnShuttleTatting.com. And here are 3 things you should know about me. I learned tatting from my grandmother when I was just 9 years old. It's something that everyone in my mom's side of the family learns. She learned with all of her siblings. My grandmother learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, and it goes back as far as we can trace. Some families have fine china or jewelry that they pass down generation to generation, and we have shuttle tatting. I taught my first class when I was 19. I was working in my local public library at the time, and when the adult services coordinator found out that I could shuttle tat, she basically demanded that I teach a class. I had never taught a class before, and I was fresh out of high school, had no idea what I was doing, and no idea that it was going to kickstart my life in the way that it did. It was another decade before I decided to bring my skills at teaching online, and ever since then, I've been teaching virtually and in-person classes all over the place. I was so nervous during that first lesson at 19, but I have learned so much since then, and it has honestly made me a better tatter in my own work to be able to teach other people. And now I get to bring over 15 years of that experience teaching to you through my book and my online course. I am not a lace historian. While I acknowledge and appreciate the effort that goes into preserving the history and the tradition of the art, that's not really where my focus lies. I don't just want to preserve the art. I want to see it thrive and evolve. In my own work, this looks like combining my love of lace, fashion, and storytelling by making wearable art pieces that feel so ancient they're new again. My hope is that my own work and my efforts in teaching and putting the knowledge out there will inspire other people to allow their creativity to be curious and explore this beautiful craft for all of its potential. If you'd like to learn more about shuttle tatting and the ways that I use it in my own personal work, you can follow me here or on my artist channels at Sparrow Spite.